And now, I am not someone who just randomly calls out drivers as the worst that I have ever seen lightly, but when it comes to Dutch driver Niels Coulion, who recently competed in 4 races in Formula 2, I can honestly say that this is not hyperbole, that in the modern era, he is possibly the worst driver that I have ever seen race in a level as high as Formula 2, and there is actually a bigger problem in the fact that he was even there in the first place. Like most people, Coulion first came onto my radar when it was announced that he would be the one to replace Taylor Barnard at AIX Racing for 2 rounds in Monza and Baku, with Barnard stepping up full-time into Formula E with McLaren for 2025 after impressing in his stand-in performances. And now, not only, as you'll notice in this video, there is barely any footage of this guy racing because he has always been at the back, but usually when a driver that I've never heard of steps up mid-season, I don't really think too much about it because coming in with minimal preparation into a series that you've never raced in before is the very definition of trial by fire. However, it quickly became apparent that the driver that was stepping up to the second highest tier of motorsport had arguably the worst racing resume that I have ever seen. Coulion only began karting at 14, which for a racing driver is extremely late, and also only started racing in single-seaters at the age of 21, when he made his debut during the end of the 2022 Spanish Formula 4 season, 3 years after he stopped racing in karts. Now, what's absolutely remarkable and actually quite topical is that his single-seater career actually mirrors Kimi Antonelli's, having raced with Kimi in 4 different championships in the space of just 3 years. In 2022, he competed in 5 races towards the end of the Italian Formula 4 Championship, scoring no points and finishing 43rd overall, whilst Kimi competed in 19 races and finished the season as the champion. In 2023, Coulion then made the same jump as Antonelli did from Formula 4 to Formula Regional, competing in the European and Middle East Championship. This time he would actually compete for a full season, but yet again, in the European Championship in 18 races, he scored no points, finishing down in 37th, whilst Kimi finished as the champion. And in the Middle East Championship, after 15 races, Coulion would again score no points, finishing down in 31st, with Kimi once again finishing the season as the champion. For 2024, Coulion's racing in the run-up to his Formula 2 debut was very sporadic, with odd outings in sports cars as well as single-seaters, before eventually ending up racing in Indy NXT, which is the support series to IndyCar. He only competed in 9 races, again not doing the entire season, and although points are handed out to every position in America, in Indianapolis, Coulion, in a race of attrition after starting 19th, came back to finish 10th, which after 3 years, still remains his highest ever finish in single-seaters. It's at this point that he would remarkably or crazily make the jump up into Formula 2, being signed by IAX to do only 2 rounds in Monza and Baku, again ending up on the same grid and in the same series as Kimi Antonelli. Now, it's important to note that even though joining a series, any series mid-season, under any circumstances is going to be difficult, Monza is probably one of the best tracks to do it at because it's not a very physical track, it's not a very technical track, and pretty much every single European Championship either races or tests there at some point, so at the very least it's a track that every single driver should be familiar with. In his very first Formula 2 practice session, he was 4.1 seconds away from the fastest time set by Maloney and 2.3 seconds slower than the next slowest in front of him, Kush Maini. Then came qualifying, which was very chaotic, with yellow and red flags causing stoppages, which actually helped Coulion as the other drivers weren't really able to set their absolute best laps given the lack of rhythm, and in the end he qualified 2 seconds behind Poleman Maloney and 1 second behind the driver in front of him, Roman Stanek, which, to be honest, actually wasn't too bad on the surface. However, whilst the chaos of qualifying had flattered him, the sprint race started to expose him. He noticeably had a really bad start at the back of the grid, and after lap 1 chaos had caused multiple cars to retire, bringing out the red flag. It meant that the sprint race would eventually be just 18 laps long. In 18 laps around Monza, he would go on to finish 48 seconds behind winner Ollie Behrman and 16 seconds behind Antonelli ahead of him, who had to come into the pits after picking up damage. In the feature race, Coulion would have yet another nightmare, which could be summed up by just one single lap. Lap 11 was the end of a safety car period which saw a bunch of drivers pitting, and with Coulon opting to stay out, he found himself running 5th at the restart. What preceded is one of the worst laps in racing history, with him locking up and going wide into turn 1, running onto the gravel at Ascari, and in the space of just one lap, he went from starting lap 11 in 5th to starting lap 12 in 20th and last. And next up was Baku, a track that a few drivers on the Formula 2 grid were driving for the very first time, and also a track with its tight walls and high-speed corners that is much more challenging technically than Monza. In practice, his pace was already embarrassing, as it was clear that he was nowhere near the car's limit and didn't have the ability, experience or confidence to even be able to go anywhere near it. He was 10 seconds slower than Enzo Fittipaldi, who topped the session, and still 5 seconds slower than the next slowest, Villa-Gomez. In qualifying, the gap was still not even close to being respectable. He was 6.7 seconds slower than poleman Shure, but more worryingly, 4.4 seconds behind the next worst driver in front of him, Pepe Marti. And now, in Baku, we can only really look at the sprint race, because in the feature race, even though he was clearly able to avoid the massive crash at the start of the race and was able to continue, for some reason the team chose to retire him at the end of the first lap, even though his car looked undamaged. In the sprint race, his race pace was beyond embarrassing. And that's not me comparing him, by the way, to the race leaders. That's just me comparing him to the next slowest car ahead of him. If we look at the 15 clean laps that he had before the field was bunched up by the safety car, after 5 laps he had fallen 10 seconds behind the car ahead. By lap 10, the gap was now 30 seconds to the car ahead. And by lap 15, if we ignore Shure and Goethe, who are outliers, the gap was up to 46 seconds to Villa-Gomez ahead of him, all the while his teammates Joshua Dirksen in the exact same car would go on to win the race. That would be the start and end to Coulon's time in Formula 2. He completed the 2 rounds that he paid to do, and as I'm sure this will come as no surprise, money is the only reason he's been able to race as long as he has, being the son of Dutch millionaire Kees Coulon, whose net worth is estimated to be in the hundreds of millions of pounds. There is no doubt that he is amongst the worst drivers to have ever raced in Formula 2, but what separates him from drivers like Mahavir Raghunathan and also Alessio De Leda, in my opinion, is that not only were those drivers marginally faster and achieved more in Formula 2 anyway, but Coulon's resume coming into Formula 2 was by far the worst out of anyone, and so as an overall driver, he is the worst that I have ever seen race at that level. The reason why I made the comparison to Kimi Antonelli earlier is because it represents the very real comparison between 2 drivers who both fast-tracked their ways through the junior ladder, but in totally different ways. Kimi was fast-tracked because he succeeded in all of the championships that he competed in, going back all the way to karting, which, despite his lack of experience, justified the quick promotions. Coulon is the perfect example of a driver who's chosen to fail upwards and fast-tracked his way through the junior formulas just because he has the money to do so. He's also managed by Fernando Alonso's A14 management agency, which I'm sure has financial reasons behind it, and to be honest, it's actually quite sad. Not just because drivers like him are taking seats away from more deserving drivers, but more so because he's purposefully chosen to set himself up for failure. It's one thing to have endless amounts of money, but you still have to use it in the right way. You have to build a good racing foundation with plenty of testing and plenty of racing across a whole season where you can learn how to work with a team and how to be able to fully develop and utilize your driving talent. Coulon is choosing to waste his money by purposefully doing it wrong, simply thinking that by quickly jumping up the ladder with minimal experience into more difficult series against better drivers and into faster and harder cars to drive, that he's going to accelerate his learning process and automatically make himself a better driver as a result. It's not out of the question that we might see him in Formula 2 again, because there's always spaces to be filled and there's always teams looking for money. But in a way, he's actually been quite lucky to have only done 4 races, because it's difficult to build a real picture of just how bad he really is. As time goes on, people are going to forget about him a lot faster compared to drivers like Raghunathan, because we got to see him race in Formula 2 for a lot longer. Maybe he'll come back and improve enough to become a point scorer, but at this current moment, with the evidence that we have, which includes his embarrassing path of getting into Formula 2, I still maintain that he is the worst driver that I have ever seen race at a level as high as Formula 2, given the resources that he has had. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe, that would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.